Good morning, everyone. We've been over the last 6 weeks or so been working through really two streams of thought, two concepts that run parallel. One is a campaign that we have been running, Good God Gospel, that is borrowed from a church in the Houston, Texas area that is kind of a network of house churches and things like that. And in reading about how it was that they trained their members kind of across this decentralized church to do evangelism in a kind of conformed way, they came upon this. You know, it's really all about having good conversations that lead to God conversations that lead to gospel conversations. And I thought, hey, I think we can do that. And we have, and we've been doing an amazing job. It's so encouraging to come through the lobby and to see each one of those ping pong balls represents a conversation that somebody's had. And the white ones, if you're new today or if you still haven't picked up on it, the white ones are for good conversations. So if you've had a good conversation with somebody, we encourage you to take one of those white ping pong balls and put it in to the container there. The orange balls are for God conversations, and I'm going to explain this a little bit by example in a second here. And then the blue ping pong balls are for gospel conversations. And so as we've been doing that, we've also been looking through the Gospel of John and seeing about how Jesus conversed with people, essentially, and how he befriended them. And we saw that especially last month, Jesus' moves to interact with people that were basically strangers or unknown to him, and how did he befriend them? And then this month we've been looking more at his interactions with those who he is friends with and has been friends with as we move to the end of the Gospel of John. Now here's guys that he's known for 2 to 3 years and spent a good amount of time with, and how does he act as a friend to them? And we learn from that. But I just wanted to take a couple of minutes as we begin today to share some stories and examples so that if you're still not real clear about, well, what makes a good conversation or a God conversation or gospel conversation. And so my typical morning routine, if I can stick to it, is dropping my daughters off at elementary school about 7:15. Oftentimes we're late, so it's 7:25, 7:35, and the car line is closing, and the teachers give me dirty looks, and the girls run out. And then I go from there to Central Park Rec Center, where I will either play basketball on Tuesday or Thursday, or try to lift some weights or do some running on Monday, Wednesday, Friday. So this was not a basketball day. I think it was a Wednesday, and I had done some weightlifting and stuff like that, and I was leaving the facilities, and I heard the basketball dribbling in the gym, which is rare on a Wednesday. Usually if somebody's playing basketball in there, it's just me by myself. And I looked through. Normally I would have just left. And so this was we had just started Good God Gospel, and I thought, So I looked in, and it was one of the guys that I had played with before, but I'd not really talked to. So I went in, and he was shooting, so I just started grabbing rebounds for him and throwing him the rebounds, and I just started talking. So, hey, man, what's your story? It's a Wednesday morning, 8:30, 8:45. Like, you got school, you got work. Like, how can you be here? I'm here. I only have to work on Sundays, so that's how I can do it. But what about you? And so he starts to talk about his school life, his family life. And we were. I think we had just kind of passed Easter, and we're in that, or somewhere around those. So I was asking him about different things. What was he up to? And so he talked about how he was going to connect with his sister and do something like that, and then get together with a friend and go to a church thing. I'm going to go with one of my friends to some church thing. So we were having a good conversation, talking about his aspirations, where he wanted to go to college, what he wanted to major in, was he going to play basketball at college, things like that. And that moved into, just through the good conversation, he brought up church. So then I could, is that something that you're into? You know, are you a spiritual person? Are you a believer? And so we had a good conversation that moved into a God conversation. Another example, this does not just have to be strangers or faint acquaintances. Last week I grabbed communion. I started talking to Tim. Tim was back there handing out communion. He's one of the best. Actually, he wasn't doing, I think his wife was doing most of the work, but that's okay. I'm sure he was just taking a break because he had worked so hard up to that point. But we started to converse, and if you know Tim will make a joke, right? He'll joke around a little bit, and so he said, are you going to count this conversation? Are you going to go put a ping pong ball in? And what does it, was it just good? Was it, and it was. We had not really talked about God. So in that prompting, I said, okay, well, let's make it a God conversation. Tell me about, what are you reading? So I got to talk with Tim the next 2 or 3 minutes, maybe even 5, about his Bible reading plan that he is trying to read through the Bible in a year, and he's got like 3 or 4 other guys, maybe more than that, that kind of keep each other accountable through the YouVersion app. They're all doing the same reading plan, and so they have that interaction. They can read that section and comment on it. So that moved from good to God. So it can happen in the church. It can happen outside of the church. It can happen in the church building. It can happen in the gym, on the sidewalk, wherever. So just a couple of examples of conversations that went from good to God. Couple more. I was kind of trafficking back and forth. We had a couple of soccer players this past season, and so we had in between games, I was running home to pick something up and do something. On the way home, there was a little traffic accident, so on the way back to the field, I'll take the back way to get back. And when I'm driving back to the soccer field, I see a man and his son walking down the side of the road. The boy's got a soccer uniform on, and this is not typical around here. You don't see people just walking on the side of the road a lot, and it was pretty obvious to me that they were walking to the soccer field. So I rolled down my window and say, hey, are you guys cool? Like, do you need a ride? And they're like, oh, yeah, and he's got this whole story about how he had just been out at some pickleball tournament that morning, so he had his keys with him. He doesn't know what happened. He lost his car key, and so they're just walking. They still had about a mile, maybe a mile and a half to go to the soccer field, and his kid's game was in half an hour. So they're like, really appreciate you picking him up. I had on the car some kind of lecture about the guy talking about like the story of redemption of God, or I think it might have been Jason rehearsing his communion. I was listening to. And we talked a little bit, and I had every opportunity in the world to have a good conversation that moved to a God conversation, and I totally failed. I mean, everything was set up, why did I come this way? He needed help. I wouldn't, all of those things, and I just completely missed it, and that was sad. All right, so just to say, I just want to let you know that I think we're all going to have those moments, right, where we can look back and say, oh, I should have said this, I could have done that, and that's okay. We're going to have those times. But what about gospel conversations? And I think that's where it can get tricky. Well, what is the difference between a God and a gospel conversation? So I just want to share 2 quick examples there, and to let you know that because I believe that the gospel conversation is probably the most difficult to have because it's the most difficult to get to, right? If you kind of think about it like a pyramid, most of your conversations are going to be or good, and then some of those good conversations will lead to God conversations, and then sometimes you'll get to really share the gospel. Unless you're just really bold and everywhere you go, you just start preaching, then that's a way to have a lot of gospel conversations. But a couple of examples here. One was there's a man in the congregation, and he's got a friend, and I didn't ask permission to share this story, so I hope that's okay. But I'll be very generic. He's got a friend, and just through email, so through some email or some physical mail exchanges, was able to share the gospel with his friend. Right, has a love for this person and a desire, knows that they don't have a faith, a strong Christian faith. And so just wanted to say, hey, in communicating with you, I want to let you know the truth about Jesus. So that's a way that you can do it. You can write it out. You can email it out. Well, that wasn't really well received. So he asked me, he said, I don't really know what to do. Can you help me? So then I got to talk with him through email, but then also in person last week about well, you know what? The gospel isn't only what Jesus saves us from, or that we don't have to go to hell and now we get to go to heaven, but there's also what he saves us to, the beautiful life that we get to live now because we live in Christ. And sometimes people get jaded to the heaven and hell stuff, but it can be really good news to them to hear about the life that Jesus has created, the opportunity for us all to live. That's a gospel conversation, speaking about the gospel. I got to talk to a young man. He's a young father. He's really, it's a struggle. 20 years old, the world says, take care of yourself. Put yourself first. You do you. And so there's all of this pressure on him. And there's the pressure within, right? Our flesh is just screaming out and crying out, like, pay attention, like, feed me, feed me. And so it's a struggle for him. He's got his girlfriend and his new baby, and he knows that he needs to die to himself and live for them. But it's so hard to do that. And so as we were just talking about the challenges of fatherhood and eventually the challenges of being a husband and making those sacrifices, I got to just say to him that this is the gospel. This is the good news of Jesus Christ, is essentially when we die to ourselves, we find life. And so through just what he's going through in his life, I was able to turn that to say, this is the promise of Jesus. If you follow him and die to yourself, follow him, then the life that you think you're going to lose, you're actually going to find. So I just wanted to take that time to go through and say, because it's hard. It's easy to just throw up some words there, but it's harder to know, well, what does this really mean? And so I mentioned, gospel, what we're going to do next month, the whole month, I'm just going to preach, the sermon series is going to be called the gospel. Gospel, period. And so we're just going to talk, what is the good news? What is the gospel? So that we can't really share the gospel if we don't really know what the gospel is. And so we're going to look at a lot of different, we're going to kind of say, I'm thinking like if the gospel's like a globe, we're going to kind of spin that thing around and kind of see a lot of different sides of what the gospel is. All right. So, befriend like Jesus. We're going to be in John chapter 20. And we're just looking at, how really, again, back to see how did Jesus interact with the people that now he had become good friends with. And most of us are familiar with a man in the Bible that is best known as Doubting Thomas. And this is the story of why Doubting Thomas is called Doubting Thomas. And so we've got John chapter 20, and I'm going to just start reading here in verse 19. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together, with the doors locked for fear of the Jewish leaders, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone's sins, their sins are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now Thomas, also known as Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." I don't have the next verse on the screen, but just listen to this. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Just a couple things. One thing in the text that I want to point out, and this is important as we think through doubt and when our friends have doubts, when our friends are going through a period of unbelief, and that is actually what Jesus says to Thomas when he says, "Stop doubting and believe." It's the same Greek word as pistos, like for believing. And so it's stop not believing and believe. And so that's important because I think there is a difference between lacking faith that leads to a lack of action or sin, and there's a difference between lacking faith that is just not having a strong enough belief for something. But we'll kind of get into that in a little bit. What causes doubt? What makes someone doubt? And I feel bad for Thomas because he is called Doubting Thomas, and that's not a great nickname. But he really does some cool things elsewhere in the scriptures. It's after Lazarus dies, one of the coolest one-liners in the whole Bible is after Lazarus dies, and Jesus is talking to the disciples about Lazarus being dead, and he's like, we're going to wait, and they're like, but we can't go through that town because last time we were there, those people tried to kill you. And Thomas is like, then let's go die with him. And he just like, boom, and he just kind of hits everybody with like, it doesn't matter. Like, let's just walk through death for Lazarus. It's just such a great moment. But that's Thomas. Like Thomas, he's got some boldness in him. He's got some faith. And so he's not just a completely unbelieving person. And so if we're not going to read through all of the beginning part of John chapter 20, but John chapter 20 tells us what's happened after Jesus is risen from the dead. So Jesus has died and he's been buried and now he's resurrected. And so it says like, on the first day of the week, and Mary Magdalene goes out to the tomb. She doesn't see the stone is rolled away, and she doesn't see Jesus there. And so she's like, she doesn't know what's going on. So she starts crying. Angels talk to her, and then Jesus talks to her. She runs back, tells the disciples, Peter and John, run to the site. And this is what it says in verse 9. It says, verse 8 says, finally the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw the empty tomb and believed. And then verse 9 says this, they still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. So they saw the empty tomb and believed, but there was still a lack of understanding. There was still something that they didn't understand. And you can imagine if you were one of the 12, and even if you had heard Jesus talk about some of this stuff, that when it actually happened, when you saw Jesus die on the cross, you saw them take his dead body off the cross, some of your friends brought the dead body to the tomb, prepared the body, wrapped it up in all kinds of stuff with the spices and the herbs and the linen and all that, and put it in the tomb, and you saw the stone get rolled in front of the tomb. For a couple of days later, no matter what Jesus had said to you, when somebody's like, he's not in the tomb anymore, there's going to be a bit of understanding. And a lack of understanding brings doubt in our life. When we just don't really when we can't wrap our minds around something, you have to go one of two directions. You have to take a leap of faith and say, I don't understand it, but I believe it, or you doubt. I need more. I need some more information. Well, here's the other thing that happened, is we did read that on the first day of the week, The disciples were all gathered. The door is locked for fear of the Jews. And then Jesus shows up. Peace be still. Or no, peace be with you. But Thomas wasn't there. And we know from earlier in the text, Mary Magdalene, when she comes to see the disciples, she says, I have seen the Lord. When Thomas gets back with the disciples, they say, we've seen the Lord. Okay, once again, put yourself in Thomas's shoes for just a minute. You've been with Jesus for the last couple years. You've been faithful. You've been good. You haven't messed up like Judas. You haven't messed up like Peter, right? Like you have been tried, you've been true, you've been with him, you've been faithful. Does Jesus have something against me? Like like all the disciples probably had a little bit of that, like, that's not fair. Why'd he show himself to Mary first, right? Like a little bit of that. But then it's later, and Jesus shows up, and all of the disciples are there, except for Thomas, except for you, right? Like, I just feel like you'd be like, Jesus, could you have waited 1 hour? Like I was gonna be back in an hour. Could you not have just waited and revealed yourself then? Could you have come the day before? The day before I was hanging out with those guys. We were all together. Why didn't you not come then? And so there's another thing that causes doubt, and that's hurt feelings or unmet expectations. That when we talk to people who are struggling in their faith and in their walk with God, sometimes it's because I'm really having a hard time wrapping my mind around some of these things. And sometimes it's because I prayed for this thing and God didn't answer my prayer, right? Like I saw God come through for them. I saw God answer their prayer. I saw all the joy that they have in their life. I see how easy they've got it. But here's the one thing I asked from God, and he just doesn't seem to want to give it to me. Like, does God not love me? And so it's not an unbelief, it's a frustration and an anger that says, well, I'm not going to believe until I can see for myself and until I can put my finger in that hole and until I can see those scars. There could be a little bit of stubbornness there. But what we want to talk about is we want to talk about Jesus. And what did Jesus do? When he had a friend who had a need, when he had a friend who was in doubt. And so again, I did read this earlier, but here it is again in John chapter 20. He says, a week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe. Now, this is the kind of cool part is Thomas was so sure, like, I need to see him and touch him. We don't see, the author here doesn't say that Thomas actually did any of those. I mean, he obviously saw him, but in just seeing him, he says, my Lord and my God. My Lord and my God. And so, how does that relate to us? How does that connect to us? First it's just seeing how amazing Jesus is. Like Jesus shows up again, knowing that Thomas is doubting, knowing that there's probably multiple things that he's having a struggle with. One, could Jesus really have risen from the grave? And two, if he did, why has he shafted me? Like, why has he put me in the background and shown himself to all these other people? And so Jesus is saying, he calls him out. He shows up and he says, Thomas, come here. Take a look. Basically, I'm showing up right now just for you. That is what Jesus did. That is what we can do. We can do it in two different ways. One, sometimes our friends are doubting and they need us to just show up for them. Like that's what they need. They need us to be Jesus for them. right? Not to take Jesus' place, but Jesus has called us to be his representatives, to be his witnesses. And so if you have a friend who's doubting in any way, now that could be doubting God, that could be doubting your love and friendship. I mean, there's multiple applications here. But sometimes that's what we just need to do is show up. It's easy for us, I think, in our flesh to, like, if we know that a friend is doubting our commitment, that we can be stubborn and be like, well, yeah, I didn't call you in the last 2 weeks, but did you call me? No, and we can kind of dig in, but that's not how Jesus was a friend. It is an interesting thing because, I just read like the rich man and Lazarus, and there, the rich man and Lazarus, who's the beggar, they both die, and the rich man is in torment, and Lazarus is being comforted. And the rich man says, well, if I can't receive this comfort, then can you please send Lazarus back to talk to my family, talk to my brothers, so that they can change. And the answer in the parable is, they've got Moses and the prophets. And if they don't believe Moses and the prophets, then they're not going to even believe somebody who comes back from the dead. And so there's kind of this struggle of, what is, and there's a couple other parables that are similar as far as, like, here's the person, like the wicked servant. There's a parable of the wicked servant. So the master goes off and he's gone, and he doesn't say, I'm going to be back on this date. It's just kind of this undetermined amount of time. The master's gone, and this wicked servant, who I guess wasn't wicked initially, this servant is put in charge of everything. And so at first, the servant is doing a good job because, the master could come back. But after a little while, he gets comfortable with it, and it's like, who knows when this guy's going to come back? So he starts beating the other slaves, making them do all the work, right? And turns into this terrible person. Then all of a sudden, the master shows up. But it's what's keyed in on both of those things is two things. It is a lack of faith. It is a lack of belief, right? That's for the rich man. It was they had Moses and the prophets. If they wouldn't believe them, they won't even believe somebody who comes back from the dead. So belief, it's really what's hinted on there and triggered on. And for the wicked servant, it was a belief about my master could come back any day. I need to be ready. And so it was that unbelief. Those things were punished. So what is different between that kind of unbelief and this kind of unbelief? Because we do see other circumstances in real life where Jesus doesn't treat people like that. There's an account in which the disciples are all on a boat and Jesus is not with them. And then Jesus appears walking on the water. They think first it's a ghost. They're not sure. Peter says, Jesus, if that's you, let me come out to you. And so he gets up out of the boat. Jesus says, yeah, it's me. He gets up out of the boat and he starts to walk on the water. But then he sees the storm, right? He sees the wind and the waves all around him, takes his eyes off of Jesus and starts to sink. Jesus reaches out and grabs him and says, why did you have such little faith? Which maybe is a bit of a chastisement in itself, but it's not a punishment. And so we see kind of these two different ideas of sometimes there's unbelief that is used as an excuse for us being wicked, right? Here's the bad thing that I want to do, and if I really believe in God, I can't get away with that. Like, I'm going to feel bad about doing that. And so the way that I can pursue my flesh and my sinfulness is by pushing away my belief in God. That's the kind of unbelief that God doesn't really have a tolerance for. A son that's been given a birthright and a position in his family, and he says, you know what? I am going to give up what has been promised for the future for what I can get right now. And that is a lack of belief in what he really has. A lack of, that's different from somebody that's struggling to wrap their mind around something. For those people, there's tons of mercy. And I think that is just what I want to encourage us is, I think a lot of the situations that we encounter when our friends are struggling and when our friends are having doubts is that it could be any of those things, but a lot of times it's just a struggle. It's just, I'm having a hard time figuring this out. Or I feel kind of hurt by God. And the way that we can be like Jesus is to show them mercy. And so that's what I want to encourage everyone today to be thinking about. Because honestly, we don't really talk about doubt a lot in our gatherings. It's not a subject that comes up a lot. But every single person here has had a time in their life that you struggled with doubt. Whether it was, I'm not sure about this doctrine, or I'm not sure about Jesus. Like, did he really live? Was he really a man? Did he really die? Did he really raise from the dead? What about some of these other things we read in the Bible? Like, do I have to believe this certain thing about creation, or do I have to believe that Noah had so many animals in the ark? Like, those are hard things to believe. Believe that God has a lot of patience for us in that. Those are hard. Those are difficult things to just be like, oh yeah, I got it. But blessed are the people that do not see and believe. And so for us, as we interact with each other, may we have a lot of patience with each other. But first and foremost, how can we show them Jesus? That was the greatest thing that Jesus could do, is show up to Thomas and say, here I am. Take a look. And that's the greatest thing that we can do for one another, is to show up for each other and to say, here's Jesus. Whether it be in our own actions or whether it be saying, hey man, hey lady, here's a scripture that we need to be reminded of today. How can we show them Jesus?